Well, hello everyone. Today we have our Sitting at John's Couch series. My name is Gökçen Pursukan and I'm making these videos from Basel, Switzerland, now together with John. So thank you, John, again.
Thank you. The next part I want to just talk about psychological categories and to give you some sort of idea of what's out there. If you were to go into any university where they have a psychology program, inside the psychology program, you'll see different sort of subcompartments, and they will follow different sort of headings. And this is pretty common throughout the world inside the university setting. The one I'm in is clinical psychology. Clinical psychology deals with mental health disorders with people doing the talk therapy we just talked about. Developmental psychology is another one. Developmental psychology is an academic discipline which looks at from birth to death, and it looks at developmental stages in life, and then they do a test to try to figure out which ones are and how subtle they are. How do you know that you're changing? How do you know when you reach puberty? What does that look like? How do you know when you become adult, middle-aged, and so on? So that's the developmental psychology works on that part. Experimental psychology is another category. What it's saying is it just does experiments that are of interest to it that aren't done anywhere else in any of the other categories. So they'll do experiments on perception, they'll do experiments on memory, so memory testing, stuff like that, both short-term and long-term memory, they'll do that. Social psychology, just by its very definition, tends to focus more on interaction between people and in groups. And it looks at the psychology behind group development and group interactions. Evolutionary psychology is a relatively new one. It wasn't there when I went through training 30 years ago, but it has come up. Right. And evolutionary psychology basically says, let's put a different angle on this and look at how we have evolved psychologically over time and see if we can sort of project over time that sort of trend. Cognitive psychology looks at cognition, thoughts. Main focus is on the neurology of the brain, and it's a growing field right now in psychology because of the different technology we now have, like MRIs and CAT scans and everything else. We're getting a better picture of what's going on in the brain. And the cognitive psychology departments are working on that piece to try to understand how our brain actually works. Related to that is neuropsychology. So neuropsychology, when I was going through school, was largely about testing for neurological disorders, right? So they would do paper and pencil tests and then be able to interpret them to see how the brain works. Right now what's going on is they're going with the cognitive guys, they're joining teams, and they're talking to each other so that they're getting a better picture of how the brain works. Another category you'll see in universities is industrial organizational psychology. IO psychology is what it's called. IO is about how you can apply psychological tools inside the workplace. It's got to do with selection of the right people for the right job. If you want a person to only focus, let's say your job is to only focus on small little chemical things, what sort of personality best fits that? Well, that type of thing. And so we would do psychological tests to determine if this person's suitable for the job. Another one is one I worked in as well, which is forensic psychology. Forensic psychology deals with the criminal population and again just tries to use psychological tools to try to figure out if we can do anything to help prevent people from committing crime. So in the academic world, that's generally what they are. Now I'm going to drop into clinical psychology a bit because that's actually our main focus, and it's also what I do. So I was trained in clinical psychotherapy, and clinical psychology looks at mental health disorders. And these are all the common ones that most people would understand, like depression, anxiety, psychosis, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. There's all sorts of subcategories of anxiety, like obsessive compulsive disorder, phobias. We would deal with the whole cluster of that. It's best to look at the clinical world in terms of two major groups. One to deal with adults, and the other one to deal with children. And the reason for that, very simply, is our brains are much different. If you specialize as an adult, you can't really just jump over to children, because if you think of a 5-year-old, the way they see the world and what you have to do to work with them is so much different. So I myself have only worked with adults. That's where I specialized in. There is a whole other group that do child psychology and child clinical psychology. This stuff largely to do with anxiety disorders like separation anxiety, oppositional disorder, which is the child just stubbornly doesn't want to do anything the parent says, and how you get your child to work with this. So that's another group. So there's the adult and child psychology group. The adult stuff down a little more. Inside that, you've got different forms of therapy as an adult that you can go to seek help. The first one, the one that Freud did, is psychodynamic, and I'll talk about that a little more in a second. The whole thing about psychodynamic therapy is the unconscious has suppressed part of the self, and the role of therapy is to get that stuff out. Behavioral stuff, it came in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It was very big. And that's the type of stuff you may have heard that they do rat experiments to train rats to do their sort of things. The behaviorists are the ones that did that. And basically what they're saying is, we don't actually have to know anything that's going on in your brain. We just have to know what motivates you to do things. And what doesn't motivate you. And once we find that out, we can build incentives in, so that's the carrot on the stick, to get you to do what we need you to do, right? So to improve your life. Or we can put disincentives in, we used to call it punishment, to stop you from doing things you don't want to do. And so the behaviorists, they took this as the form of therapy. And again, this was very common in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in particular. Around the mid-60s, largely as the baby boomers all came into therapy, they started doing a split into different groups. One of them is the stuff I do, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. And the second one is humanistic psychology. The key person there was a guy named Carl Rogers. He does positive regard is what he gives. So he kind of, the way he does it is sort of being genuine and present and giving you lots of support, and you therefore tell him what to do, and you work through the dynamic of that exchange. This is a much kinder, gentler form of therapy. And there are different ones inside humanistic. Gestalt therapy is another one which is practiced here. They're all humanistic psychology. That's what they come under. And we talked about cognitive behavioral, which is the one I do. What they figured out about 1965 is that your thoughts, feelings, and behavior are all tied together. What that means is if you've got problems with your feelings, like let's say you're feeling highly anxious, I don't have to target anxiety. I just have to target your behavior, what you're doing or not doing, and your thinking. And if I change these guys, this guy's going to change automatically. That's the central premise of cognitive behavioral therapy. In the next section, I'm going to talk about two forms of therapy. I'll go into more detail. One's on psychodynamic therapy, which is the original one, and then I'll go into more detail on CBT, which is what I do, cognitive behavioral therapy. So early on, I talked about if you go into any university and they have a psychology department, different types of subcategories that you'll find there, like clinical and developmental and social and evolutionary. But I want to talk now about what's coming forward, so what the newest stuff out there is, because it's actually a very exciting time in psychology in general and in the academic world in general. The separate departments, we're getting to a point where we can start to move them together on a common theme. For example, biology, chemistry, biochemistry, neurology, neurobiology, all of that, and psychology are all sort of coming together. So in neurobiology, for example, a lot of it comes from new innovation, new technology. So it was in the 70s that CAT scans and MRIs were developed. Now we've got fMRIs and PET scans, and all of those instruments are now giving us pictures into the brain that we didn't have before. So remember I told you in a previous video that when we talk about mental health disorders, what we're actually talking about is observation of the patient and the patient talking to us, because we had no picture of what's going on in the brain. Right now, we're discovering an awful lot more of what's going on in the brain, and it's actually shifting our definitions. And when I talk about depression in a later video, you're going to see that depression right now is not well defined, because it's kind of switching, because we're learning more and more what depression is, where before all we had was a cluster of symptoms. Human genome is another one. Gut microbe in the gut and how they influence and react in the body and the brain. Human genomes, genetic coding, epigenetics, all of this stuff is brand new, and it's all now starting to integrate into all these different fields. AI technology, new technology, you think of what those guys are doing, they're trying to create a human brain. So they're working hard at coding and they're trying to figure out how the brain works just like everyone else is. So we're now learning stuff from all these different points of view, from these different angles, and they're starting to converge. There's also computational mathematics is doing this, emergence theory. These are all new fields that are going to take psychology in a much different direction than it was previously had been when I went to school. And the reason I want to tell you this is because it's actually a very exciting time. If I were to go back and choose to do this all over again, I would be looking for a university that not just has a psychology department, but has a psychology department which is now working in teams with other departments, so that the work you're doing now works at a much different level. It's actually quite exciting when you get everyone from these different departments, fields, different departments coming in and talking, and you're learning from everyone else. For those people who are thinking about going in this direction, I just wanted to say this is actually a really good time to get into the field. There's always going to be lots of people with problems, so there's always going to be a need for psychotherapists, but the way we're going to approach it in the future is going to look a lot different than the way we approach it currently. Okay, thank you very much.